London, 1818. The scullery of Blackwood Hall was always cold, even in summer. At this late hour, with October frost creeping across the windows, Audrey Rose could see her breath mist in the dim candlelight as she scrubbed the flagstones. Her hands, once soft and cared for, were now chapped raw from lye soap and endless labor. At 20 years of age, she had become a ghost in her own ancestral home. Above her head, the floorboards creaked with hurried footsteps. Lady Dunning's shrill voice echoed through the corridors, barking orders at the household staff. Tonight was the Cumberland Ball, and the Dunning family was in a frenzy of preparation. Audrey's two stepsisters, Georgiana and Penelope, had spent the day preening and primping, their dressing rooms strewn with silks and jewels that had once belonged to Audrey's late mother. "Audrey!" The sharp call made her flinch. "Get yourself upstairs this instant." She rose stiffly, smoothing her worn gray dress, and climbed the servants' stairs to the drawing room. The transformation was immediate and jarring. Where the scullery was all shadows and dampness, here was light and warmth. Her stepmother stood before a gilt mirror, adjusting an emerald necklace that Audrey recognized with a pang. It had been her mother's favorite. "The Duke of Blackwood will be at the Cumberland Ball tonight," Lady Dunning announced, her eyes glittering with calculation. "This is our opportunity. Georgiana or Penelope will secure him." She turned to Audrey with a cruel smile. "You will attend as well." Audrey's heart stuttered. In 3 years, she had never been permitted to attend a society function. "Don't look so hopeful, girl. You'll go as our attendant. Someone must be available to fetch our wraps and repair any torn hems. Mrs. Winters has found you something suitable to wear." The way she said suitable made it clear it would be anything but. Lord Dunning appeared in the doorway, his florid face already flushed with pre-celebration brandy. Since assuming control of the estate after Audrey's mother's death, he had systematically stripped Blackwood Hall of its value while parading his daughters through society on the remnants of the family fortune that should have been Audrey's inheritance. "The Duke is notoriously particular," he said, eyeing his daughters critically. "Wealthy beyond measure, but impossible to predict. He's refused a dozen matches already." His gaze slid dismissively over Audrey. "Make yourself useful tonight, girl. Stay in the shadows where you belong." As Audrey curtsied and withdrew, she caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. Pale, thin, invisible. A servant in the house that bore her family's name. She had no way of knowing that within hours, the formidable Duke of Blackwood would see past her shabby gown and recognize exactly who she was, changing everything forever. The dress lay across Audrey's lap like an accusation. Pale blue silk, delicate as morning frost, with intricate pearl beading along the bodice. She remembered her mother wearing it to a summer garden party years ago, remembered how the fabric had caught the sunlight, how her mother had laughed and spun in a circle just to make Audrey clap with delight. Now Georgiana had claimed it, and the seams needed letting out to accommodate her fuller figure. Audrey's needle moved mechanically through the fabric, each stitch precise despite the tremor in her fingers. The scullery's single candle provided barely enough light for such delicate work, but she had learned to manage. She had learned to manage many things in the 3 years since her stepfather had taken control of Blackwood Hall. The door at the top of the stairs banged open, and Penelope's voice rang out. "Audrey, Mother wants you in the drawing room immediately. And bring the blue dress. Georgiana must try it on again. Audrey gathered the gown carefully, draping it over her arm to avoid creasing, and climbed the narrow servants' stairs. Her knees ached from kneeling on the cold flagstones, but she kept her expression neutral as she emerged into the warmth and light of the main house. The drawing room was chaos. Georgiana stood on a stool in her chemise and petticoats, while a harried modiste pinned the hem of a rose-colored gown. Penelope sat at the vanity, trying on various feathered headdresses with increasing dissatisfaction. Lady Dunning presided over it all from her chair, a general surveying her troops before battle. Finally, Lady Dunning snapped when she saw Audrey. Georgiana, try the blue. We must decide between that and the rose. Audrey helped her stepsister into the altered gown, enduring Georgiana's impatient sighs and sharp elbows. When the last button was fastened, Georgiana turned to examine herself in the mirror. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her hands over the silk that had once belonged to Audrey's mother. "The Duke of Blackwood won't be able to resist." "One hopes," Lady Dunning said dryly. "Though from what I hear, Sebastian Hawke is not easily impressed. He's refused every eligible woman presented to him for the past 2 seasons. Penelope abandoned her feathers and joined her sister at the mirror. "They say he's impossibly cold, that he evaluates potential brides like one might evaluate horseflesh." "Then we must ensure he sees quality," Lady Dunning replied. She turned her sharp gaze to Audrey. "Stop hovering like a specter. Make yourself useful. My correspondence is on the escritoire. File it properly." As Audrey moved to obey, she caught fragments of their continued conversation. "The Duke's fortune is immense," Lady Dunning was saying. "And, more importantly, his connections are unimpeachable. Whichever of you secures him will elevate this entire family." Lord Dunning entered then, already dressed for the evening in his best coat. The smell of brandy preceded him. "I've just come from the club. Blackwood will definitely attend. Tonight. Apparently he's looking to acquire property in this area." His eyes glinted with calculation. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say? Audrey's hand stilled on the letters. Blackwood Hall had been her mother's family seat for generations. The property technically belonged to her, held in trust, out until she married or reached the age of 25. But Lord Dunning had appointed himself trustee and administrator, and for 3 years had systematically drained its resources. "The man's rich as Croesus," Lord Dunning continued. "What would he want with more property?" "The Duke of Blackwood is known to be exacting in all his dealings," Lady Dunning said thoughtfully. "Perhaps he collects estates the way other men collect art." They discussed the Duke as though he were a particularly challenging business venture. Audrey finished with the correspondence and tried to slip from the room. But Lady Dunning's voice stopped her. "One more thing, Audrey. You'll attend the ball tonight." Audrey turned slowly, certain she had misheard. In 3 years, she had been forbidden from every social engagement, every church service, every public appearance that might remind society of her existence. Lady Dunning's smile was thin and cruel. "Don't look so surprised. Your sisters will need someone to attend to their needs throughout the evening. Torn hems, misplaced fans, refreshments when they're too engaged in conversation to fetch their own." She gestured dismissively. There's an old gown in the attic trunk. Brown muslin, I believe. Terribly plain, but serviceable. Alter it to fit yourself. You'll blend into the background nicely. But, Mother, Georgiana protested, what if someone recognizes her? What if they remember she's— No one will recognize her, Lady Dunning interrupted sharply. Look at her. 3 years in the scullery have erased whatever prettiness she might have possessed. She looks like exactly what she is, a servant. She turned back to Audrey. You'll stay in the shadows, make yourself available when needed, and speak to no one unless directly addressed. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am, Audrey whispered. Good. Now go find that dress and make it presentable. We leave at 8 o'clock sharp. Audrey curtsied and fled to the attic. The trunk was where Lady Dunning had indicated, buried under holland covers and forgotten furniture. The brown muslin was at the bottom, creased and musty. It had been a servant's dress even when new, high-necked, long-sleeved, utterly plain. As Audrey carried it down to the scullery to begin alterations, she caught her reflection in a tarnished mirror on the landing. Lady Dunning was right. The girl who stared back was pale and thin, her blonde hair dull from lack of proper care, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Nothing remained of the cherished daughter who had once run laughing through these halls. She was a ghost in her own home. And tonight, she would be a ghost at the ball. Before we continue with Audrey's story, let me ask you something. How many times have you watched these videos, felt all the emotions, enjoyed the entire journey, and then just left? No like, no subscribe, nothing. Meanwhile, I'm here at 2 a.m. writing these chapters, pouring my heart into every scene, every kiss, every confrontation. It takes 30 seconds to hit that subscribe button and like this video. Just 30 seconds to support the work that gives you hours of escape. If you've ever felt something watching these stories, if Audrey and Sebastian's journey is touching your heart right now, prove it. Subscribe. Like. Share with someone who needs this story and tell me where you are watching from. Don't be the person who takes and never gives back. Now, let's see what happens when Audrey is forced to attend that ball. The Cumberland Ball was everything Audrey remembered from her childhood, and nothing like it at all. The assembly rooms blazed with candlelight from 3 massive chandeliers, their crystal drops casting rainbow fragments across the polished floor. The air was thick with perfume, beeswax, and the subtle scent of hothouse flowers arranged in towering urns. Music swelled from the orchestra gallery, and couples whirled past in a kaleidoscope of silk and satin. Audrey pressed herself against the wall near the refreshment table, trying to become part of the damask wallpaper. The brown muslin hung loosely on her frame despite her alterations, and she was acutely conscious of how shabby she must appear among the peacock brilliance of London society. Several matrons had already glanced at her with puzzled frowns, clearly trying to place her face or determine what business a servant had standing in the main ballroom. Across the room, Georgiana and Penelope held court, their gowns shimmering as they laughed and flirted with a circle of admirers. Lady Dunning stood nearby, her sharp eyes cataloging every interaction, calculating which gentleman might prove most advantageous. Lord Dunning had already disappeared into the card room. "Lemonade," Georgiana called, not bothering to look in Audrey's direction, simply snapping her fingers as one might summon a dog. Audrey moved quickly to fetch it, keeping her eyes downcast, her movements small and unobtrusive. This was her role tonight, the invisible servant, the forgotten daughter. A commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. The crowd seemed to inhale collectively, conversation faltering mid-sentence. "The Duke of Blackwood," the footman announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed ballroom. Sebastian Hawke stood framed in the doorway, and Audrey understood immediately why the room had fallen silent. He was tall, powerfully built, with dark hair and features that might have been carved from granite, but it was his eyes that arrested her. Pale gray, cold and assessing, sweeping across the assembly with the detached interest one might show a ledger of accounts. At 33, he wore his power and wealth with casual indifference. His evening clothes were perfectly tailored but understated, eschewing the peacock colors favored by younger men for stark black and white. He needed no embellishment. His title and presence were ornament enough. The crowd parted as he moved into the room. Mothers straightened, pushing their daughters subtly forward. Young ladies arranged themselves in becoming poses, smiles practiced and perfect. But the Duke's gaze slid over them all, without pause, without interest, as though they were merely furniture in an unfamiliar room. Audrey shrank further into her corner, grateful for the shadows. This man was clearly out of her sphere, as distant as the stars. She had no business even looking at him directly, yet she found she couldn't look away. The Duke accepted a glass of champagne from a footman, exchanging brief words with Lord Hartwick. His expression remained impassive, bored even, as various guests attempted to engage his attention. He was performing the minimum requirements of civility, nothing more. Then, without warning, his gaze swept across the room and locked on her. Audrey's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she was certain he was looking past her, at something or someone behind her. But his eyes didn't move. They remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse race with sudden fear. He began walking toward her. The crowd noticed. Conversation stuttered and died. Heads turned to follow his trajectory, trying to determine his destination. Georgiana straightened expectantly, smoothing her skirts. Penelope arranged her features in what she clearly hoped was an alluring smile. The Duke walked past them both without a glance. He moved with purposeful strides, cutting through the assembly like a ship through water, his focus never wavering from Audrey's corner. She pressed herself harder against the wall, her heart hammering. Had she done something wrong? Was she about to be publicly humiliated for daring to stand in the main ballroom? He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, he was even more formidable. The cold assessment in his gray eyes should have frozen her. But there was something else there, too. A sharp intelligence. A flash of what might have been recognition. His gaze dropped to her hands, still clutching the empty lemonade glass. She saw his eyes fix on the ring she wore on her right hand. A small thing, tarnished gold with the Blackwood family crest engraved on its face. It had been her mother's, and before that, her grandmother's. The only piece of jewelry Lady Dunning hadn't managed to pry from her fingers because it was too small, too insignificant to be worth selling. Something shifted in the Duke's expression. His eyes narrowed, and when he looked at her face again, it was with an entirely new assessment. The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on them. "Your name," he said. His voice was deep, commanding, pitched to carry. It was not a request. Audrey Rose," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "My lord. Your grace, I mean." "Louder," he commanded. "Audrey Rose," she repeated, her voice shaking. Something like triumph flashed across his features. He turned to face the room, and when he spoke, his voice rang out with absolute authority. "This lady, Miss Audrey Rose, is mine to claim." The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Audrey stared at him in absolute incomprehension. Had he gone mad? Had she? Before she could process what was happening, he took the glass from her nerveless fingers and set it aside. Then he took her hand, the one with the ring, and placed it on his arm. "You will dance with me," he said, though it was clearly not a question. And then Sebastian Hawke, Duke of Blackwood, led her onto the dance floor as 300 members of London society watched in stunned silence. The morning sun streaming through the windows of Blackwood Hall's drawing room felt like an accusation. Audrey sat rigid in a chair that had once belonged to her mother, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them trembling. She was still wearing the brown muslin from the night before, having been forbidden to retire to her scullery quarters. Lady Dunning had locked her in her old bedroom, stripped bare years ago of anything valuable, with strict instructions not to show her face until summoned. The summons had come at 9 o'clock sharp. Lord Dunning paced before the fireplace, his face mottled with rage and something that looked dangerously like fear. Lady Dunning sat on the settee, her lips pressed into a thin line. Georgiana and Penelope had been sent to their rooms, though Audrey could hear their muffled protests from the floor above. "This is unconscionable," Lord Dunning spat. "The Duke of Blackwood dancing with a servant. With you. Making a spectacle of our family in front of all society." He whirled on Audrey. "What did you say to him? What lies did you tell?" "I said nothing," Audrey whispered. "I don't understand what happened any more than you do." "Don't play innocent with me, girl. You've been scheming." The drawing room door opened without preamble, and the butler appeared, his face pale. "Your lordship, the Duke of Blackwood is here to see you." The room fell silent. Lord Dunning's face drained of color, then flushed an even deeper red. "Show him in," he managed. Sebastian Hawke entered the drawing room as though he owned it, which Audrey realized with a jolt he might as well have done given the authority he emanated. In the morning light, he was no less formidable than he had been in the ballroom. If anything, the stark daylight emphasized the hard planes of his face, the cold calculation in his gray eyes. He swept the room with a single glance, his gaze lingering on Audrey for just a moment before settling on Lord Dunning. "Your Grace, Lord." Dunning bowed stiffly. "To what do we owe the honor?" "Dispense with the pleasantries, Dunning." The Duke's voice was cold, clipped. "I am here on business, and I prefer to conduct it expeditiously." He glanced at Lady Dunning. "You may leave us. This concerns Miss Audrey Rose and her stepfather only." Lady Dunning bristled. "I hardly think I wasn't making a request." The steel in his voice left no room for argument. Lady Dunning rose with as much dignity as she could muster and swept from the room, though she shot Audrey a look of pure venom as she passed. When the door closed, Sebastian turned to Lord Dunning. "Sit down, both of you." He gestured to the chairs before taking a position standing before the fireplace, the traditional place of the master of the house. Audrey sank into her chair. Lord Dunning remained standing, his pride demanding resistance even as his common sense clearly urged compliance. The Duke simply waited, one eyebrow raised, until Dunning finally sat with ill grace. "I'll be direct," Sebastian said. "I know you're in possession of Blackwood Hall illegally, Dunning. The estate was held in trust for Miss Audrey Rose by her late mother's will, to be administered by a trustee until her marriage or her 25th birthday. You assumed the role of trustee, but you've exceeded your authority considerably." Lord Dunning's face went ashen. "I don't know what you've been told, but I've been told nothing. I've examined the public records myself. Your trusteeship gives you the right to maintain the property and provide for Miss Audrey Rose's welfare. It does not give you the right to drain the estate's accounts, sell off its assets, or treat the rightful heir as a servant in her own home." Audrey's breath caught. She had known, of course, that her circumstances were wrong. But to hear it stated so baldly, with such authority, made it real in a way it had never been before. "Furthermore," Sebastian continued, "I've made inquiries into your financial situation. You're drowning in debt, Dunning. The creditors are circling. Within 6 months, possibly less, you'll be ruined entirely." He paused, letting that sink in. "Unless, of course, we come to an arrangement." Lord Dunning leaned forward. "What sort of arrangement?" "I want Blackwood Hall. It borders my northern estate, and I've had my eye on it for some time. The most efficient way to acquire it is through marriage to its rightful heir." He looked at Audrey then, his expression unreadable. "I propose to marry Miss Audrey Rose." The room spun. Audrey gripped the arms of her chair, certain she had misheard. "Your Grace, I don't—" "In exchange," Sebastian continued, speaking over her, his attention back on Dunning, "I will pay off your most pressing debts, enough to keep you from debtor's prison and maintain a modest household for your wife and daughters. You will, of course, relinquish all claim to guardianship over Miss Audrey Rose and sign over any remaining administrative rights to the estate." Lord Dunning's eyes gleamed with avarice, warring with suspicion. "How much are we discussing?" £10,000. It was a fortune, more than enough to save Lord Dunning from ruin. Audrey watched her stepfather calculate, saw the exact moment his greed overcame his pride. "And if I refuse?" Dunning asked, though they both knew he wouldn't. "Then I take the matter to Chancery. I expose your mismanagement publicly. You'll be ruined anyway, but with the added stain of scandal and possible criminal charges." Sebastian's smile was cold. "I'm offering you a way out, Dunning. I suggest you take it." Lord Dunning was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded curtly. "I accept your terms." "Excellent. My solicitor will call this afternoon with the papers." Sebastian finally turned his full attention to Audrey, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not warmth, precisely, but perhaps not quite the cold calculation he'd shown Dunning. "Miss Audrey Rose, might I speak with you privately?" Lord Dunning stood, relief and resentment warring on his features. The garden, perhaps. I'll be in my study. He left quickly, clearly eager to escape before the Duke changed his mind. When they were alone, Sebastian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He moved to sit in the chair Dunning had vacated, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "Why?" Audrey's voice was barely a whisper. "You could have any woman in London. Why me? Why this?" "Because you're the key to what I want." He was brutally honest, at least. "The estate. But also," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because what I witnessed last night was unconscionable. You deserve better than servitude in your own home." "So this is charity?" "No. This is a business arrangement that happens to benefit us both." He sat back. "I'll be plain with you, Miss Audrey Rose. I'm offering you a marriage of convenience. Your name will be restored. You'll have independence, autonomy over a secondary estate I own in Somerset, and the protection of my title. In exchange, I get Blackwood Hall and an heir eventually." Audrey stared at the man who had just proposed to alter the entire course of her life with the same detachment one might use to discuss a horse trade. His gray eyes remained steady on her face, waiting for her response with patience that somehow felt more like indifference. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then you remain here, subject to Dunning's whims until you reach 25. 2 more years of the scullery, of servitude, of watching what should be yours slip away piece by piece." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm offering you freedom, Miss Audrey Rose. Perhaps not the romantic sort found in novels, but freedom nonetheless." She looked down at her hands, still chapped and reddened from years of harsh work. 2 more years. Or she could accept his offer and escape immediately. The choice, when laid out so starkly, was no choice at all. "What exactly would you require of me?" she asked quietly. "Your name on the marriage certificate. Your cooperation in acquiring the estate legally. And eventually, children to secure the succession." He said it as clinically as if discussing crop rotation. "Beyond that, you would have complete autonomy. I own a property in Somerset, Thornfield Manor. Smaller than Blackwood Hall, but well-maintained and profitable. You would manage it as you see fit. The income would be yours to control. And you? Where would you be?" "Here, in London. At my primary seat in Northumberland when necessary. Our paths would cross infrequently." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens her mother had once tended, now overgrown and wild. "I'm not offering you affection, Miss Audrey Rose. I'm offering you independence, a title, protection, and the resources to live as you choose. Those things have value even without sentiment." Audrey rose as well, her legs unsteady. "How long do I have to decide? I'm having the marriage settlement drawn up this afternoon. The wedding will take place in 3 days at my private chapel. You have until this evening to give me your answer." He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "But I think we both know what that answer will be." His arrogance should have angered her. Instead, she felt only a hollow certainty that he was right. "Yes," she said. "I accept your terms." Something flickered across his face. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief. Good. My housekeeper will call tomorrow with appropriate clothing. You'll move to my London residence the day before the wedding. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. No false expectations, Miss Audrey Rose. I'm offering you a business arrangement, nothing more. I won't pretend affection I don't feel, and I expect the same courtesy from you. I understand perfectly, Your Grace. He nodded once and left, his footsteps echoing through the hall that would soon no longer be her prison. The wedding took place on a gray Thursday morning in the Duke's private chapel, witnessed only by his solicitor and housekeeper. Audrey wore a gown of pale gray silk that Sebastian's housekeeper had procured. Beautiful, expensive, and utterly impersonal. She might have been a doll being dressed for display. Sebastian stood beside her in stark black, his expression as remote as it had been in the drawing room 3 days prior. The vicar rushed through the ceremony with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to performing such expedient marriages for the nobility. When Sebastian slipped the heavy gold ring onto her finger, his hands were steady. Hers trembled. I now pronounce you man and wife. No kiss. Sebastian simply nodded to the vicar, signed the register with a bold scrawl, and waited while Audrey added her own shaking signature. Audrey Hawke, Duchess of Blackwood. The name looked foreign, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The settlements are finalized, Sebastian said as they left the chapel, his hand barely touching her elbow in a gesture of courtesy rather than affection. Dunning has been paid and has signed over all claims. Blackwood Hall is now legally mine. Yours, he corrected, though the amendment felt perfunctory. I'll have my steward begin restoration work next week. Thank you, Audrey said, because it seemed expected. No thanks necessary. It's a sound investment. He handed her into his carriage, which bore the Blackwood crest on its door. I'm having your belongings sent to Thornfield Manor. You'll leave for Somerset tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? She had assumed she would have at least a few days in London, time to adjust to her new circumstances. There's no reason to delay. The manor requires a mistress, and I have business in town that will occupy me for the foreseeable future. He climbed in after her, settling on the opposite seat with careful distance between them. My housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, will accompany you. She served my family for 30 years and knows the property intimately. She'll assist you in assuming your duties. The carriage rolled forward, carrying her away from the chapel and toward Sebastian's London townhouse. Audrey watched the streets pass, feeling strangely disconnected from her own body. She had escaped the scullery of Blackwood Hall only to find herself in a different sort of prison, one gilded with wealth and title, but isolating nonetheless. At the townhouse, Sebastian helped her down with the same impersonal courtesy. I've had the blue suite prepared for you. Dinner is at 8, though I have an engagement this evening and won't be joining you. He paused, seeming to search for something else to say. Mrs. Davies will see to anything you need. Of course, Audrey murmured. He nodded and turned away, already dismissing her from his thoughts. She watched him stride into his study, the door closing firmly behind him. Mrs. Davies appeared at her elbow, a handsome woman of perhaps 50 with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Your Grace, if you'll follow me, I'll show you to your rooms. Your Grace. The title felt like a costume she was wearing, ill-fitting and strange. She followed Mrs. Davies up the grand staircase to a suite of rooms decorated in shades of blue and cream. Beautiful, expensive, cold. "His Grace keeps very regular hours," Mrs. Davies said as she showed Audrey the dressing room, already filled with gowns she'd never chosen. "He's often engaged with business. You'll find he's very considerate of your privacy." Privacy. Such a careful word for absence. That night, Audrey dined alone in the grand dining room, seated at one end of a table that could accommodate 20. The food was exquisite, served by silent footmen who treated her with perfect deference. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, mistress of multiple estates, one of the most powerful women in England. And she had never felt more like a servant, waiting for orders that would never come. The letter arrived at Thornfield Manor 3 weeks after Audrey's marriage, delivered by a rider bearing the Blackwood crest. Mrs. Davies brought it to the morning room where Audrey had been reviewing the household accounts, one of the few tasks that gave her days any sense of purpose. "From His Grace," Mrs. Davies said, her tone carefully neutral. Audrey broke the seal with hands that had finally begun to heal, the redness fading, her nails growing back properly. Small mercies. "Miss Audrey Rose," the letter began, and she felt a sting at his refusal to use her married name. "I require your presence at Blackwood Hall to consult on the restoration work. A carriage will collect you tomorrow at 10 o'clock. The visit will require 3 days. Bring appropriate clothing. Blackwood." No greeting, no explanation. Simply a summons, as impersonal as everything else about their arrangement. Yet despite herself, Audrey's heart quickened. Blackwood Hall. She hadn't set foot in her childhood home since the morning after the Cumberland ball, when she'd been whisked away to London and then to Somerset. The thought of seeing it again filled her with a complicated tangle of longing and dread. The journey took most of the day. As the carriage rolled through the familiar gates, Audrey pressed her face to the window, expecting to see the same dilapidated facade, the overgrown gardens, the general air of neglect that had characterized the estate under Lord Dunning's tenure. Instead, she saw scaffolding. Workmen swarming over the roof, replacing missing tiles. The windows, which had been filmed with grime, now gleamed in the afternoon sun. The drive had been freshly graveled, and someone had begun clearing the weeds from what had once been her mother's rose garden. The carriage stopped and a footman handed her down. Sebastian emerged from the main entrance, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his dark hair slightly disheveled. She had never seen him anything less than perfectly composed, and the sight stopped her short. "You're early," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I expected you wouldn't arrive until evening." The roads were better than anticipated. She couldn't stop staring at the house, at the transformation already evident. "What have you done?" "Restoration, as I indicated in my letter." He gestured for her to follow him inside. The roof was in worse condition than I initially assessed. 2 of the chimneys required complete rebuilding. We've replaced the windows on the east wing and repaired the structural damage in the servants' quarters. The entrance hall, which had been dim and water-stained, now glowed with fresh plaster and paint. The marble floors had been cleaned and polished. The grand staircase, which had been missing several balusters, was whole again. "I don't understand," Audrey said slowly. You said you wanted the estate for its land, for the border it shares with your northern property. Why invest so much in the house itself? Sebastian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The house is part of the estate. It would be poor stewardship to let it fall to ruin. He led her through room after room, each in various stages of restoration. Workmen nodded respectfully as they passed, and Sebastian seemed to know each one by name, asking after the progress of specific tasks with the detailed knowledge of someone intimately involved in the project. They reached the library, and Audrey stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. The room had been her mother's sanctuary, filled with books collected over generations. Under Lord Dunning, it had become a storage room for broken furniture and discarded items. She had assumed the books were long since sold, but now the shelves were being carefully restored, each volume cleaned and catalogued. New shelving was being built to match the original woodwork. The windows, which faced west to catch the afternoon light, had been fitted with new glass. The books were in the attic, Sebastian said quietly from behind her. Dunning had them moved up there when he needed the space. Many were damaged, but I've had a bookbinder working to restore what could be saved. Audrey walked slowly into the room, running her fingers along the spines. Books her mother had read to her. Books she had read herself as a child. Books she thought she'd lost forever. Why? She whispered, turning to face him. For the first time since she'd met him, Sebastian looked uncomfortable. He moved to the window, staring out at the gardens where workers were clearing decades of overgrowth. My mother died when I was 8, he said finally. My father remarried within the year to a woman who couldn't stand the sight of anything that reminded him of his first wife. She had my mother's room stripped, her belongings sold or burned. The gardens she'd planted were torn out and replaced with something more fashionable. His voice was flat, carefully devoid of emotion. By the time I inherited, there was nothing left of her. Not a portrait, not a letter, not a single rose from her garden. Audrey's throat tightened. I'm sorry. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. He turned to face her, his expression guarded. I'm telling you so you understand why I won't allow the same thing to happen here. This house is your inheritance, Miss Audrey Rose. Your mother's legacy. Whatever else our arrangement may be, I won't be the one to destroy that. She saw then what she had missed before, the careful way he handled the books, the attention to detail in every restoration choice, the fact that he was here personally overseeing the work rather than delegating to a steward. This wasn't about property value or investment returns. This was personal. The gardens, she said. May I see them? He nodded and led her outside. The work was in its early stages, but she could see the care being taken. The old rose varieties her mother had cherished were being carefully pruned and revived. The walking paths were being cleared and re-graveled. Someone had even found the stone bench where her mother used to sit in the evenings, half buried under ivy, and was in the process of cleaning and repairing it. I have the original garden plans, Sebastian said. They were in the estate records. I thought. He paused, that uncomfortable expression flickering across his face again. I thought you might want to be consulted on the restoration, to ensure it's done as your mother would have wished. Audrey sank onto the bench, heedless of the dust and workers around her. For 3 weeks, she had lived in comfortable isolation at Thornfield Manor, convinced that she had simply traded one form of servitude for another, that Sebastian saw her as nothing more than a means to an end, a name on a marriage certificate that gave him legal access to property he wanted. But this was something else entirely. "You didn't have to do this," she said, looking up at him. He met her gaze, and for just a moment, his carefully constructed walls seemed to waver. "Perhaps I did." They stood there in the garden as the afternoon light slanted gold across the grounds, and Audrey began to understand that the cold, calculating Duke who had claimed her at the ball was not the whole story. Behind his walls was a man who had lost his own mother's legacy and was determined to protect hers. It wasn't affection. He had made that clear. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The discrepancies in the accounts were subtle at first, small amounts that might have been dismissed as clerical errors. But as Audrey spent more time at Blackwood Hall, working through years of neglected ledgers in the estate office, a pattern began to emerge. Lord Dunning had been siphoning funds even after relinquishing guardianship. She found Sebastian in the library, where he'd taken to working in the evenings while overseeing the restoration. He looked up from his correspondence as she entered, taking in her expression with one sharp glance. "What is it?" Audrey set the ledgers on his desk. "Dunning has been forging withdrawal orders, small amounts spread across different accounts, but it adds up to nearly £1,000 since our marriage." Sebastian's expression darkened. He pulled the ledgers toward him, scanning the entries she'd marked with quick, efficient focus. The muscle in his jaw tightened. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on these records, at least 6 weeks. Possibly longer. I've only reviewed the accounts back to January." She sat in the chair across from his desk, suddenly exhausted. "I should have caught it sooner. I should have been paying closer attention." "You've been at Thornfield. You couldn't have known." He closed the ledger with controlled force. "I'll have my solicitor handle it. Dunning will repay every penny, or I'll see him in court. He doesn't have it to repay. Whatever he took is already spent. Then he'll face the consequences." Sebastian stood moving to the window with the restless energy she'd begun to recognize as a sign of his anger. Unlike Lord Dunning's volatile rages, Sebastian's fury was cold and precise, all the more dangerous for its control. "He's my stepfather," Audrey said quietly. "He's a thief who's been stealing from you for years." Sebastian turned to face her. "He treated you like a servant in your own home, drained your inheritance, and is now attempting to defraud you even after signing away his rights. Why would you protect him?" "I'm not protecting him. I'm simply saying that public scandal affects me as well. If this goes to court, society will talk. They'll say I married you under false pretenses, that the estate wasn't worth what you paid." Sebastian was silent for a long moment, studying her with that penetrating gray gaze. Then he returned to his desk, pulling out a sheet of paper. "We'll handle it privately," he said finally. "I'll send word through my man of business that any further attempts at fraud will result in immediate criminal prosecution. That should be sufficient to deter him." He began writing, his pen scratching across the paper with sharp, precise strokes. Audrey watched him work, noting the way the candlelight caught in his dark hair, the focused intensity of his expression. Over the past 3 days, she'd seen more of him than in all the weeks of their marriage. He worked alongside the restoration crew during the day, discussing structural details and original design elements with surprising knowledge. In the evenings, he retreated to the library to manage his other estates and business concerns. She had begun joining him, bringing her own work, the Blackwood accounts, correspondence with the Thornfield steward, decisions about the garden restoration. At first, they worked in silence, sharing only necessary communication. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, that had begun to change. "The rose garden," she said now, breaking the silence. "I found my mother's planting journal among the books you restored. There are notes about specific varieties, where they were purchased, how they should be pruned." Sebastian looked up. "That's excellent. Give it to Morrison. He's the head gardener. He'll want those details." "I thought I might work with him directly, if that's acceptable." Something shifted in his expression. "This is your home, Miss Audrey Rose. You don't need my permission to restore your mother's garden. Legally, it's your home. Our arrangement was quite clear on that point." "The arrangement," he said slowly, "was that you would have autonomy. I meant that." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary before Audrey looked away, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. These moments had been happening more frequently, small instances where the careful formality between them wavered, revealing something more complicated underneath. "I'll speak with Morrison tomorrow," she said. They returned to their work, but the silence felt different now. Companionable rather than merely civil. An hour later, Sebastian set down his pen. "I've been meaning to give you something." He left the library, returning several minutes later, carrying a small trunk she didn't recognize. He set it on the desk between them, then stepped back, his expression carefully neutral. "I found this listed among the items Dunning sold to settle his debts. I purchased it from the creditor before the auction." Audrey's hands trembled as she opened the trunk. Inside were her mother's personal effects, things she'd assumed lost forever. A pearl necklace her mother had worn every day, embroidered handkerchiefs with her monogram, a miniature portrait of Audrey as a child, letters tied with ribbon, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet. "He sold these?" Her voice broke. "These weren't even valuable. They were just yours," Sebastian finished quietly. "They were yours, and he had no right to them." Audrey lifted the miniature portrait with shaking hands. Her mother had commissioned it for her 5th birthday. She remembered sitting still for hours while the artist worked, her mother promising her sugar biscuits if she was good. "How much did you pay?" "It doesn't matter." "How much, Sebastian?" His name slipped out before she could stop it. She'd never called him anything but Your Grace, or occasionally, My Lord. The use of his Christian name seemed to startle them both. £500, he said after a pause, a fortune for items with no monetary value. Items precious only to her. "Why?" she whispered, looking up at him. "Why would you do this?" He moved around the desk, stopping close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his gray eyes. For once, his careful control seemed to waver. "Because I remember what it feels like to have nothing left of the person you loved," he said. "Because despite what I said about our arrangement being merely business, I find I cannot stand the thought of you suffering that same loss when it was within my power to prevent it. The air between them felt charged, heavy with words unspoken. Audrey stood, still clutching the miniature, and found herself only inches from him. "Thank you," she said. "Truly. This means," her voice failed, "everything." Sebastian's hand rose as if to touch her face, then dropped back to his side. "You should retire. It's late." But neither of them moved. They stood there in the candlelit library, surrounded by her mother's books and his careful restorations, the formal distance of their arrangement crumbling a little more with each passing moment. Finally, Sebastian stepped back, putting safe distance between them once more. "Good night, Miss Audrey Rose." "Good night," she whispered. But as she gathered her mother's treasures and left the library, she realized he hadn't corrected her earlier. She had called him Sebastian, and he had answered. "I need to pause here and be honest with you. Do you know how many of you are watching right now without subscribing? The analytics don't lie. Thousands of you watch every upload, binge every series, and somehow that subscribe button is invisible to you. Here's the truth. Every video I don't post because the algorithm buries it is a story you'll never hear. Every time you watch without engaging, you're telling YouTube this content doesn't matter. And I know it matters to you because you're still here. You're invested in Sebastian and Audrey. You want to see them get their happy ending. So do something about it. Hit subscribe, smash that like button, share this with your friends. Be part of the community that keeps these stories alive, instead of the silent viewer who lets them die. Now, back to the story. The letter from Lord Dunning arrived during breakfast, delivered by a messenger who departed before Sebastian could send him away with it unread. Audrey watched her husband's expression turn to stone as he scanned the contents, the muscle in his jaw tightening in that way she'd come to recognize as suppressed fury. "What does he want now?" she asked, setting down her teacup. Sebastian crushed the letter in his fist. "Money. He claims the settlement I paid him was based on fraudulent accounting, that he's owed an additional £5,000. And if it's not forthcoming, he'll make certain allegations public." "What allegations?" "That I coerced you into marriage. That you were underage and the ceremony invalid. That the estate transfer was obtained through duress." He threw the crumpled paper onto the table. "All lies, but damaging enough if widely circulated." Audrey felt ice settle in her stomach. "He won't stop, will he? Even after everything, he won't stop?" "No," Sebastian said grimly. "Men like Dunning never do. They squeeze until there's nothing left to take. Then they squeeze harder." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I'll handle it. I'll have my solicitor draft a response threatening criminal prosecution. If that doesn't work, it won't work." Audrey's voice was flat. "You don't know him the way I do. Threats only make him more desperate, and desperate men do foolish things." "Then what do you suggest?" The edge in his tone was sharp. "That we simply pay him? Reward his extortion? No, I suggest we do nothing. Let him make his allegations. Society already thinks our marriage is strange, a reclusive duke claiming an unknown woman at a ball. What's one more scandal?" Sebastian turned from the window, his eyes blazing. You think I'll allow him to publicly question your honor? To imply that He bit off whatever he'd been about to say, his control reasserting itself. No, absolutely not. Why does it matter? Audrey stood as well, frustration rising to match his. You made it clear this was a business arrangement. You wanted the estate. I wanted freedom from servitude. We both got what we wanted. Why does it matter what anyone says about the circumstances? Because it matters to me. The words burst from him with uncharacteristic vehemence. He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Do you truly think so little of yourself? That your reputation, your dignity means nothing? I think I'm being practical. I've spent 3 years invisible, Sebastian. Being talked about is hardly worse than being ignored. Stop it. His hands gripped her shoulders, not roughly, but firmly enough that she couldn't look away. Stop diminishing yourself. Stop acting as though you're still that girl in the scullery with no choices and no value. Aren't I? The words came out bitter. You didn't claim me at that ball because you saw me, Sebastian. You saw the ring. You saw the estate. I was just the unfortunate necessity that came with it. His eyes darkened. Is that truly what you think? It's what you told me. A marriage of convenience. No false expectations. Independence in exchange for property rights. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. You've been very clear about the terms of our arrangement. The terms? He stopped, seeming to struggle with something. Damn the terms. And then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was nothing like she'd imagined a kiss might be. Not gentle or tentative, but fierce and demanding, as though he were trying to prove something neither of them could articulate. His hands moved from her shoulders to frame her face, tilting her head to deepen the kiss. Audrey's gasp of surprise gave him access, and the sensation sent heat flooding through her body. She'd been kissed once before, by a neighbor's son when she was 16. A clumsy, awkward thing that had left her underwhelmed. This was nothing like that. This was fire and need and a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer rather than pushing him away. She felt his heartbeat racing against her palms, as rapid and unsteady as her own. The controlled, calculating Duke had vanished, replaced by someone raw and wanting. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. Sebastian's eyes were wide, almost shocked, as though he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. He started, then stopped. His hands dropped from her face as though she'd burned him. Forgive me. That was inappropriate. The formal words, so carefully chosen, felt like a slap. Audrey wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. Inappropriate, she repeated numbly. Yes. I should not have. He stepped back, putting distance between them once more. The walls she'd seen crumbling over the past weeks seemed to slam back into place. It won't happen again. Of course not. We have an arrangement, after all. She forced the words out through the tightness in her throat. No false expectations. Something flickered in his expression, pain, perhaps, or regret. But it was gone before she could identify it. I'll deal with Dunning, he said, his tone formal once more. "You needn't concern yourself with his threats." "As your grace wishes." The use of his title rather than his name made him flinch. But he didn't correct her. Instead, he gave a stiff bow and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Audrey sank into her chair, her fingers touching her lips where she could still feel the ghost of his kiss. For a few brief moments, she'd thought, hoped, that perhaps their arrangement had become something more. That the man who restored her mother's garden and rescued her mother's belongings might have feelings for her beyond mere obligation. But he'd made it clear. The kiss was a mistake, inappropriate, something to be regretted and never repeated. She'd been a fool to imagine otherwise. Sebastian had claimed her for her property, and whatever kindness he'd shown was simply good stewardship, nothing more. The coldness she'd felt in their early marriage had never truly thawed. It had merely been disguised by proximity and shared purpose. She was still alone, just in a grander house, with better food and a husband who kissed her like she mattered before remembering that she didn't. The summons to London came 3 days after the kiss that Sebastian refused to acknowledge. They had barely spoken since that morning, exchanging only the most necessary pleasantries over silent dinners. Audrey had retreated to Thornfield Manor, convinced that distance would ease the ache in her chest. It hadn't. Now Sebastian's letter demanded her immediate return to his London townhouse. Lord Dunning had made good on his threats. Mrs. Davies delivered the news with her usual discretion as she helped Audrey into the carriage. "The rumors have spread quickly, Your Grace. They say Lord Dunning has been telling anyone who will listen that you're not the true heir to Blackwood Hall, that your mother had an affair and you're illegitimate, that His Grace married you under false pretenses and the estate transfer is fraudulent." Audrey's hands clenched in her lap. "I see. There's more." Mrs. Davies hesitated. "He's claiming the Duke coerced you into marriage, that you were an innocent girl who didn't understand what you were signing." The carriage rolled forward, carrying her toward London and the scandal that awaited. Audrey stared out the window, watching the countryside blur past, and felt the familiar instinct to disappear, to hide, to make herself small and invisible until the storm passed. But she was the Duchess of Blackwood now. There was nowhere left to hide. Sebastian was waiting when she arrived at the townhouse, pacing the drawing room like a caged wolf. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the same tension in his frame that she'd seen before the kiss, that barely controlled energy that suggested his famous composure was hanging by a thread. "You've heard," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Davies informed me." Audrey removed her gloves carefully, focusing on the small task to steady her hands. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we've received a pointed invitation to the Duke of Cambridge's gala tomorrow night. A command performance, essentially. Society wants to see us, to judge whether Dunning's allegations have merit. And if we don't attend, then we confirm every suspicion. The rumors become accepted fact." He moved to the window, staring out at the street. "I won't have your name dragged through the mud because of that bastard's lies." Our names, Audrey thought. He was worried about both their reputations, though he couldn't seem to admit it. "What do you propose?" "We attend. We face them down. We show society a united front." He turned to face her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I know you prefer the shadows, Audrey. I know the thought of being the center of attention terrifies you. But tomorrow night, we'll have no choice." It was the first time he'd used her Christian name since the kiss. The sound of it in his voice made her chest tighten. I understand," she said quietly. His jaw worked, as though he wanted to say something more. Instead, he simply nodded. "The gala begins at 9. Wear something that makes it clear you're the Duchess of Blackwood. I want no one to mistake your position." The dismissal was clear. Audrey curtsied and left, climbing the stairs to the blue suite that still felt like a beautiful prison. The ballroom of Cambridge House blazed with 1,000 candles, and it seemed every member of London society had crowded inside. Audrey stood at the entrance beside Sebastian, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning in their direction. The whispers started immediately. She could see it in the way heads bent together, in the flutter of fans raised to hide moving lips, in the assessing gazes that swept over her from head to toe. Sebastian's arm tensed beneath her fingers. "Steady," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "You're the Duchess of Blackwood. They should be nervous about facing you, not the reverse." But Audrey's instinct screamed at her to retreat, to find a shadowed alcove, to disappear. This was worse than the Cumberland Ball. At least then, she'd been invisible. Now, every eye was on her, judging, speculating, wondering if the rumors were true. "Your Grace, how delightful." Lady Thornbury appeared before them, her smile sharp as a blade. "We've heard such interesting things about your marriage. So sudden, wasn't it? One might almost call it precipitous." "One might call it decisive," Sebastian replied coolly. "I saw what I wanted and claimed it. Surely that's not so unusual. And what exactly did you want, Your Grace? The lady or the estate she brought with her?" The question was delivered with saccharine sweetness, but the insult was unmistakable. Audrey felt herself shrinking, her shoulders curving inward, her gaze dropping to the floor. 3 years in the scullery had taught her well. When attacked, make yourself smaller, less visible, less of a target. Sebastian's hand covered hers on his arm, warm and steady. "Careful, Lady Thornbury. You're speaking of my wife." "Of course. Though one does wonder about her parentage. Given Lord Dunning's rather detailed allegations." "Enough." Sebastian's voice cut through the conversation like a knife. The ballroom around them seemed to quiet, conversations faltering as attention turned to the confrontation. "My wife's parentage is impeccable, her legitimacy beyond question, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me directly." Lady Thornbury paled and retreated, but Audrey could feel the weight of the room's attention pressing down on her. She wanted to run, to hide, to be anywhere but the center of this spectacle. Sebastian must have felt her trembling, because he leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Trust me." Before she could respond, he was moving, drawing her forward into the ballroom. Not to the sides, not to the shadows where she longed to hide, but directly to the center of the room. The crowd parted before them like water, conversations dying as they passed. The orchestra, perhaps sensing the drama, struck up a waltz. Sebastian turned to face her, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade away. "Dance with me," he said. It wasn't a request. Sebastian, I can't. Everyone is watching. Good. Let them watch. His hand settled at her waist, drawing her into position. Let them see that you belong here. That you belong with me. The music swelled, and he swept her into the dance. Audrey had learned to waltz as a girl, but she had never danced like this, held close, guided with absolute confidence, moving as though they were the only two people in the room. Look at me, Sebastian commanded softly, when her gaze tried to dart away to the watching crowd. Not at them, at me. She obeyed, meeting his eyes, and saw something there that made her heart stutter, not the cold calculation she'd grown accustomed to, but heat, intensity, possession. I claimed you once at a ball, he said as they turned, and society was shocked. Tonight, I'm claiming you again. Let them whisper all they want. You're mine, Audrey Rose, and I protect what's mine. They danced at the center of Cambridge House, surrounded by whispers and speculation, and for the first time since the Cumberland Ball, Audrey didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, claimed, protected, and perhaps, though she barely dared to hope, wanted. The confrontation came at the height of the evening, when the ballroom was at its most crowded and the champagne had loosened tongues. Audrey and Sebastian had just finished their second waltz, another deliberate statement, when a commotion at the entrance drew every eye. Lord Dunning stood framed in the doorway, his face flushed with drink and desperation. He'd clearly forced his way past the footmen, his cravat askew, his coat rumpled. The Duke of Cambridge himself started forward to eject the intruder, but Dunning's voice boomed across the ballroom before he could be removed. There stands the Duke of Blackwood, with his fraudulent bride. Dunning's words were slightly slurred, but loud enough to carry. That girl is no true heir. She's the product of my late wife's infidelity, a bastard with no claim to the Blackwood name or estate. The ballroom erupted in scandalized gasps. Sebastian's hand tightened on Audrey's waist, holding her in place when she instinctively tried to shrink away. This man obtained Blackwood Hall through deception, Dunning continued, emboldened by the attention. He married an impostor, and I demand the return of property that rightfully belongs to my family through my late wife's marriage. Your late wife who left the estate in trust for her daughter, Sebastian said, his voice cutting through the chaos with icy precision. A trust you systematically plundered while treating that daughter as a servant in her own home. Lies. She's not my late wife's daughter. She's the bastard of some. You will stop speaking. Sebastian's tone could have frozen fire. He released Audrey and moved forward, positioning himself between her and Dunning. You will stop speaking, or I will make you stop. The Duke of Cambridge finally reached Dunning, flanked by footmen. Lord Dunning, you will leave immediately, or I'll have you forcibly removed. Not until justice is served, not until this fraud is exposed. Dunning's eyes were wild, desperate. A man with nothing left to lose. I have proof. Documents that show her mother's infidelity, that prove the girl has no legitimate claim. You have forgeries, Sebastian interrupted. Manufactured evidence that you hoped would intimidate me into paying your extortion demands. Did you truly think I wouldn't have my investigators examine every document related to Blackwood Hall? That I wouldn't verify the legitimacy of my wife's parentage before making her my duchess? He pulled a folded paper from his inner coat pocket and held it up. This is a sworn statement from the midwife who attended Audrey Rose's birth, confirming that she is the legitimate daughter of Viscountess Blackwood and her husband. This, he produced another document, is the registry from the church where she was christened. And this is a letter from Viscountess Blackwood's own physician, written shortly before her death, explicitly naming Audrey Rose as her sole heir and expressing concern about Lord Dunning's intentions. The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation. "Your allegations are lies," Sebastian continued, his voice ringing with authority. "But even if they weren't, even if there were some question about lineage or legitimacy, it wouldn't matter." Audrey's breath caught. What was he saying? Sebastian turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes made her heart stutter. The ice had melted, leaving something raw and honest and terrifying in its intensity. "I didn't claim you at the Cumberland Ball because of the estate," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "I claimed you because I saw a woman who had survived years of cruelty with her spirit intact, who stood in the shadows wearing a servant's dress, but carried herself with more grace and dignity than any pampered debutante in that ballroom." He moved closer, and Audrey found she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at him as he continued. "I saw the ring, yes. I recognized the crest, but what made me cross that ballroom and claim you in front of all society wasn't the property you represented. It was you." His hand rose to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "It was the way you held your head high despite your circumstances, the way you looked at your stepsister's finery without envy, only resignation, the way you seemed to glow in the shadows like a candle in the dark." "Sebastian," she whispered, tears burning in her eyes. "I told myself it was practical, a business arrangement. I told myself I was being strategic, that claiming you was simply the most efficient way to acquire the estate." His other hand came up to frame her face, and Audrey saw that his own eyes were bright with emotion. "I lied. To you, to myself. I wanted you from the moment I saw you, and every day since has only made that wanting sharper." The ballroom had ceased to exist. There was only Sebastian, his hands gentle on her face, his gray eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. "I restored your mother's garden because I couldn't bear to see you lose anything else. I bought her belongings because the thought of you grieving for them kept me awake at night. I've kept my distance because I was terrified." His voice broke slightly. "Terrified that you could never want a marriage based on such a cold beginning. That you'd never forgive me for claiming you like property instead of courting you like you deserved." "You're wrong," Audrey said, her own hands coming up to cover his. "You're so wrong." She rose on her toes and kissed him, there in the center of the Duke of Cambridge's ballroom, in front of all the society that had watched her claim and judged her worth. This kiss was different from the one in the breakfast room, not born of anger or frustration, but of choice, of claiming. Sebastian responded immediately, his arms coming around her waist to lift her against him, deepening the kiss with a passion that made the assembled guests gasp and whisper. But Audrey didn't care. Let them talk. Let them whisper. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she was claiming her duke. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Audrey turned to face the ballroom. Lord Dunning stood between two footmen, deflated and defeated. The crowd watched with avid fascination. "Lord Dunning," Audrey said, her voice clear and strong, nothing like the whisper she'd used for 3 years in the scullery. "You stole my inheritance, my home, and 3 years of my life. But you couldn't steal what mattered most." She looked up at Sebastian, seeing her own emotions reflected in his eyes. "You couldn't make me forget who I was. And you couldn't prevent me from finding someone who saw my worth, even when I'd forgotten it myself." She turned back to Dunning, lifting her chin. "I am Audrey Rose Hawke, Duchess of Blackwood, legitimate daughter of Viscountess Blackwood and rightful heir to Blackwood Hall. And you have no power over me anymore." Sebastian's arm came around her waist, solid and supporting. "Remove him," he said to the Duke of Cambridge, "and send word to my solicitor. I want criminal charges filed for fraud, extortion, and embezzlement by morning." As Dunning was escorted out, still sputtering protests, the ballroom remained frozen. Then, slowly, the Duke of Cambridge began to applaud. Others joined in, and within moments, the room was filled with the sound of approval. Sebastian turned Audrey to face him once more, oblivious to the crowd. "I love you," he said simply. "I should have said it weeks ago. I should have said it the moment I realized it was true. I love you, Audrey Rose. And if you'll have me, truly have me, not as a marriage of convenience, but as a husband who adores you, I swear I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." Audrey smiled through her tears. "You already have," she whispered. "And I love you too. So much it frightens me. Then we'll be frightened together." He kissed her again, and this time Audrey felt it in her soul. The transformation from arrangement to devotion, from claim to choice, from convenient to forever. She had been a servant in her own home, invisible and forgotten. But the Duke of Blackwood had seen her, claimed her, and loved her. And she claimed him right back. So there it is. Audrey got her happy ending. Sebastian finally admitted what his heart knew all along. And you got to experience every emotional moment of their journey. Now here's my question. Was it worth 30 seconds of your time? Because that's all it takes to subscribe, like, and share this video. If this story moved you, if you felt anything watching Audrey and Sebastian fall in love, then prove it. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. Like so the algorithm shows this to others who need it. Share it with your friends who live for historical romance. Be part of this community. And if you want more stories like this, drop a comment telling me which trope you want next. I read every single one. Now go subscribe, like, share, and send out, and I'll see you in the next love story. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.